Hi there, Alec. How are you?
I'm fine, Ian. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm glad we're getting this opportunity to have a quick chat about the momentous or other than momentous comments Nicola made this afternoon in Holyrood. What was your take on it, Alec?
Well, I think we've moved forward a bit in terms of two things. First of all, I think it's the right thing to do is to preempt the unionist attempt to declare a referendum organised by the Scottish Parliament is illegal. And I think that's a good move because we'll now get clarification from the Supreme Court as to whether the Scottish Parliament can have a legal referendum or not. Now, clearly, you would think it would be legal given that every other referendum that's ever been held in the UK and Scotland has been a consultative referendum, although in actual fact, although they were described as consultative, everybody knew if the result was the result would be implemented. End of story. We clearly from Westminster don't have that kind of commitment, even if the referendum is legal. But the thing that's really important is we now have a Plan B. In terms of if the referendum, for whatever reason, doesn't happen or isn't allowed to happen, then we know now that we're going to go into the next UK general election seeking a mandate to deliver independence. And I think that's extremely important and it's the right thing to do. I think, I've always been of the view that a plebiscite was a better option for us. I can understand why there was a demand by Alex Salmond to switch the strategy 20 years ago to a referendum. But the danger has been since 2014 that the SNP has become the referendum party rather than the independence party. So exactly. I think what today does is confirm that we are the independence party. But while I think today's news is welcome, I think there are two big issues that really now need to be very urgently addressed. The first one is to unite the independence movement in every shape and form, whether these are formal organisations or informal organisations, whether it's individuals who support independence but might vote for the unionist parties when it comes to elections, whatever. All the people in Scotland who support independence, we must try and mobilise as many as them as possible. Whether it's a referendum, because it's still an outside possibility, it could still be a referendum or a plebiscite. Either way, we've got to unite the independence movement. And the second thing, Ian, we've got to do, and this is where I think you're bang on, we need to concentrate now on what we need to do to win it, to persuade more than 50% of the population that independence is the right way forward for Scotland. And that means we've got to, and again, this comes back to not just internally in the SNP. For example, this time we need a currency policy that it's acceptable to the wider movement as well as to the SNP. But we also have a lot of homework to do on things like borders and so on. I think it would be a mistake to tie in independence to membership of the EU. I think the two things are separate. Because I think that would weaken the case simply because, we don't know what terms and conditions we would be expected to go into the EU on. So I think you minimise the risks by having a policy on currency, on borders, on trade and all the rest of it, which ideally is supported across the independence movement, but answers in simple language that people can understand, but which is intellectually as well as politically robust, that we give people answers to the questions. And amongst that, one of the mistakes we made in 2014 was that we didn't give pensioners a reason to vote for independence. And they were key, numerically key to the result. And the result was the unionist parties, particularly the Labour Party, went round the doors telling the pensioners that if they voted yes to independence, they could lose their state pension. Now, this time, we should go in with a plan, not just to rubbish that nonsense, but also a plan to lift our pensioners from being the lowest paid pensioners to being amongst the highest paid pensioners in an independent Scotland over the initial period of independence. We've got to go out and excite people, get them.
And attack, Alec.
And attack, absolutely.
Yes, I agree with you, Alec, about the pension position. That was definitely a weakness back in 2014, and it's easily solved because we can point to our neighbours in Ireland and say, even look at Ireland, what they've been able to do with pensions, and compare it with Scotland. And I also agree with you about not joining the EU. In fact, funnily enough, I think we'll be doing the SNP a favour by saying not to rejoin the EU, because their policy on currency, where they're planning for us to use the British currency for a number of years, that debars you from joining the EU. You know, so they're in a completely contradictory position, which we can help them by saying Scottish pound, you know, join EFTA, problem solved, we're back in the single market, you know, and we can decide at some later date if there's more advantage in being in the EU. But it's certainly not something at the start that we want to do.
No, and if we decide, if an independent Scotland decides, you know, and you know, take at least 5 years probably, as most realistic people agree, it would take at least 5 years to negotiate a deal probably, because you've got to go through a procedure if you want to join the EU. But that should be a decision for the Scottish people in a referendum in an independent Scotland. It's not, should be tied up with the independence referendum, because actually it opens up too many hostages to fortune. And I'm not saying that because I voted for Brexit. I'm saying that just because of common sense, that joining EFTA is a much better situation, because it gives you the advantages of being in EFTA at the same time as not having the disadvantages that would come into the independence campaign if it was part and parcel of the independence argument that, you know, by voting for independence, you're also voting for membership of the EU. That should be a separate decision and a separate referendum at the right time, once we know the terms and conditions of any EU application.
And of course, the other advantage is, you know, apart from solving the currency problem, it also makes life a lot easier with our fishermen. As well, because you can be part of EFTA without having the EU regulations in fishing, which would give a pretty big boost to what's an important industry. Doesn't employ enormous numbers, but it's an important strategic industry in Scotland. I mean, I've got to say, I worry, however, you know, and I accept what you're saying, it is a positive move forward today, and we shouldn't be negative. We should accept that there's a positive advantage in what's happened today. But I don't think Nicola, with the greatest respect, is the strategic commander that we need to win in 2024 or whatever. I mean, a lot of her strategic moves have been very, very damaging. I mean, if you just take some recent ones, the both votes SNP resulted in 37 unionist MSPs being elected to the parliament, and the end of the opportunity of a supermajority that would have made all this academic. Secondly, it was repeated in the local elections. And I mean, it's just stirring up trouble. Because of that, you've ended up with all these unionist coalitions across Scotland controlling the councils, if necessary, trying to block any referendum. I mean, so she's not a strategic thinker, and I think we need that. But of course, that may come in the all-party coalition, perhaps, that we're all hoping for.
Well, there'll need to be an umbrella, or particularly if it's a referendum, there'll need to be an umbrella organisation. If it's not a referendum and it's a plebiscite, I still think there should be some form of mechanism to unite the entire independence movement. Although people will be asked to vote SNP, and while I think Dennis Canavan did a good job the last time as chair of the umbrella organisation, I do believe that there has to be, you know, a widening. There needs to be a much more collective leadership taking the strategic decisions on the campaign, and not down to one person, no matter who that person is.
Absolutely. I mean, groups like SSRG, Salvo, the claim of right argument, these all have a definite central place in our campaign for independence, and they must have a voice. And I mean, Civic Scotland was also very involved in the previous referendum to set up the Scottish Parliament, and we
Yeah,
should be looking to involve them again as well.
yeah,
Now, I mean, we don't all need a vote, you know,
no,
but we all need a voice. That's the key thing. And we need some sensible, moderate people to be in control of that overreaching. People
aye,
that can live with the SNP, but can also live with ALBA, ISP, SSRG, whoever
yeah,
you want to talk about. We need to all
absolutely.
come together.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you take an issue like the currency, you know, in my view is we should adopt a policy as an independence movement of there being a separate Scottish currency, because I mean, clearly, if you look at other countries like Iceland and how they managed to recover substantially and relatively quickly from the 2008 crash, which hit Iceland very badly. The reason they were able to do that was primarily because they had control over their own currency, and they were able then to pursue a policy that was right for Iceland. It might not have been right for other people, but it was right for Iceland. And I think that's a very good example of the benefits of having your own currency. Now, we've got to be honest and say, you know, if you have a currency, you either let it float or you fix it. If you fix the rate, then that requires a lot of foreign exchange reserves to hold that rate potentially. If you don't, then it can either float up the way or float down the way. Either way, there are winners and losers. So we've got to look at, you know, how do we sell this to the Scottish people in terms of the benefits of that, and not just in terms of the currency per se, but the benefits in terms of growing the economy, creating jobs, dealing with inflation, and all the rest of it. I mean, one of the main reasons why inflation's gone up just now is because the value of the pound has gone down quite dramatically. And that actually is not primarily, I don't think, because of the pound per se, is because, particularly since the war in Ukraine started, there's been a massive international movement in the money markets to go into the dollar, which has actually led to the devaluation effectively of the euro and the pound. And created, you know, or not helped with inflation. Now, I don't want to get into all that kind of detail, but my point is, it's not just a case of saying, yeah, we'll have a Scottish pound. We've got to be ready for the attacks this time, because clearly the currency issue was a weak spot for us in 2014. We suffered from that. The main reason it was a weak spot was the policy allowed them to have a
I
currency
see,
union.
absolutely.
You need two to tango, and they said, well, we're not going to tango. If it's a Scottish currency, we don't need them to tango. If it's
Yeah.
sterlingization, you don't need them to tango so much, but you need to tango to an extent. So the less tangoing we need to do, the less we're, during the campaign, at the behest and at risk of being undermined by the unionist side.
Well, I'm one of these guys that finds it very difficult to get highly excited about the currency issue, because unlike most Scots, I've been through two currency changes in my
Yeah,
business when I was in Estonia, where
yeah,
they created a completely brand new currency, you know.
yeah,
And I mean, it was a much simpler process than anybody would let you possibly know over
aye,
here. You know, there's no reason to get excited about it. It's quite easy. You get a fortnight, I think in Estonia's case, you had 4 weeks when you could spend your rubles. At the end of the 4 weeks, every ruble you had could be converted into the new Estonian currency, kroons. After that date, all transactions were in kroons. But if your granny suddenly died and you discovered a whole mass of rubles under her bed 10 years later, you could still take them into the bank and change them over into kroons. It was
yeah,
no big deal. I mean, we've allowed ourselves to, you know, as you say, because we wanted some involvement with the Bank of England after independence, you know, we've allowed them to interfere in it and try and overcomplicate it, which
yeah,
is what they always do.
aye,
But I mean, there's no reason for that to be effective this time round. I mean, my personal favourite would be to have an independent Scottish pound secured against a basket of currencies.
yeah,
The dollar, because we have oil and oil sold in dollars. The euro, because that will be a very big trading market. And the pound,
yeah,
because England will still remain and be a significant market for us. Now, I don't think that's difficult to understand. I think it's very sensible. The big problem, as you mentioned, with creating a currency has inadequate foreign reserves.
Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. If a country as rich as Scotland, with oil and gas bought in dollars, and with the biggest export base per head of population in the UK, can't acquire foreign currency, then there's something badly wrong. I think the Scottish pound would be quite strong. In fact, it may be too strong. And
Yeah.
there's other economic measures we'd have to take, later on because of that. But I mean, we should not be scared of these things. But I mean,
Absolutely.
if we can take it back to what Nicola said today, what do you want to see as a SNP, retired now MSP, but fairness to you, Alec, you were one of the more competent MSPs in the time you were in Parliament. What would you like to see the SNP doing now?
Well, I think getting the campaign organised and getting their homework done so that in all these critical issues, we have the answers for people to the questions they're bound to ask during the campaign about, if I vote yes, what happens? What's an independent Scotland look like? And I think what we need to do is to show the difference that independence would make and use that to persuade people. I mean, if you look at the polls, Ian, basically there are three groups of people in Scotland. There are those who come hell or high water are going to vote for independence no matter what. There is another group, people like Douglas Ross, who come hell or high water are never going to vote for independence in a month of Sundays. And then you've got the third group who are swing voters on this issue. We have got to persuade as many of those swing voters as we possibly can to come over to the yes side to make sure that we win this. Whether it's a plebiscite or a referendum, we need those people, enough of them, to come over to support us. So I think our main target has to be those swing voters. And a lot of them, their main concerns are around the different aspects of the financing of an independent Scotland, because they've been fed all this guff for years that we couldn't afford to do it on our own, the oil will run out and all this sort of stuff, the currency issue and all the rest of it. So I think that's where the main focus is, including pensions, because that's a financial matter. And I think that's where we really this time have to have answers. I mean, quite frankly, the vote is not going to be swung on whether the BBC continues to broadcast in Scotland when we've got our own Scottish Broadcasting Company, or whether we can take part in the UK lottery, or whether we have our own lottery. These are not the big issues. The big issues are the bread and butter issues, particularly at the moment because of the cost of living crisis. And we've got to have the answers and show the evidence to people that very clearly Scotland would be better off as an independent country, both in the short term and in the long term. And I think that's where the focus needs to be.
Well, I agree with a lot of that, Alec, but I would also want to see, running very strongly alongside that, the claim of right arguments.
Yes.
The fact that our country's been, cheated, frankly, over the centuries, and treated as a second-class citizen, and what was never meant to be England dominating. The Treaty of Union's quite clear. If you read it, there's safeguards in there. The claim of right's quite clear. And it becomes very, very difficult for Westminster to argue that the claim of right doesn't stand, because to argue that the claim of right doesn't stand means that the Treaty of Union itself becomes void. Aye. And we can tie them up in knots in this, Alec, because the only way they can get out of it is to say, well, we were being duplicitous at the time. We conned you, and we've got you, and we're holding on to you. Well, you can imagine how that's going to get down in Scotland. Exactly. People will say, "Oh, do you think so?" We'll soon change that. So, I mean, I think we need, economics are important. Yes, we've got to make the arguments in pensions and every pound and all the rest of it. But we've also got to make the moral argument that we as a people exist, that we have a right to prosper, that we should be ruled by the people we elect, not what England elects. Exactly. And I think if we make these arguments, people can see very clearly. A lot of people are scared with economics, but a lot of people also are quite clear about there's something wrong when another country elects the government that's ruling you. And they can understand that. We didn't do enough of that, I don't think, in 2014.
I agree. I mean, the claimant right, actually, it's not just about what happened many hundreds of years ago, or the modern claimant right that was signed by Labour MPs, except all the Labour MPs at the time, except Tam Dalyell. A very good example of where the claimant right has not worked is in the last 12 years, where we had 10 years of total austerity that has brought people to their knees. We've got a Tory government that's implementing policies that, in Scotland, we would never begin to contemplate. And that's where the claimant right, I think, and economics come together, Iain, because it shows if the claimant right is lived up to and we can elect a government that follows a policy that we are happy with and content with, then which is much more geared to the needs of people who are at the poorer end, for example, a fairer Scotland, all these things, to tie the two things together, the claimant right, the economic and financial case, as well as the social case and the political case, that all needs to be brought together into a very forceful campaign. And we should also, it might be happening as we speak, I don't know, but I would be doing a lot of polling at the moment amongst those people who are swing voters on the issue of independence, because I think we've got to make a personal plea. We've got to try and identify these people in our local communities and work on them and persuade them this time that, they've really got to support Scotland, because if not, then the claimant right becomes meaningless, because we'll just go on as we've been for the last umpteen years, where we end up with governments that we don't elect, and these governments pursue policies that we don't agree with and which do enormous damage to the economic and social fabric of our country. So the two things are actually linked. And I think I agree with you. You've got to appeal to the heart and the head in this campaign.
Yeah, well, leave me in charge of the heart, but because I'll get some good ideas about that. But I mean, thank you, Alec. We just wanted to have a quick discussion. It's been worthwhile. Am I leaving a more optimistic Alec Neil than you were when you first woke up this morning?
I am. Yes, I am more optimistic, because I can now see. I've always thought if without a plan B, we were going nowhere. We've now got a plan B. And that's extremely important, because folk can now see that, we're just over 400 days. If it goes to the plebiscite election in about 400 days' time, maximum, might come before then, maximum, when the election's called, then this really is the biggie, for the Scottish people. And they've got to assert themselves as they've never asserted themselves before, or haven't done so for a long, long time. And during that polling day, on general election day, assuming it will be the election, then, as somebody has said, between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 a.m. that day, they have the power to transform Scotland forever and for good and for the good of the Scottish people.
I know who it was that said that. It was my friend and yours, Jim Sellers.
That's right.
That said that. Bang on. One question, Alec. If the election came before the court moves were completed, what would be your position? Should we still use the first available general election for a plebiscite election? Would it be acceptable for Nicola to say, oh, well, it's still in court, we'll have to wait for the outcome? Or do you think it's now the first general election that comes along?
Well, assuming the general election is, I think it's unlikely the election will come before the court case, given the problems that Boris Johnson and the Tories have. I think they're unlikely to want an election. But supposing that happens, then my view is, look, it means by definition the Supreme Court has kind of chucked the thing into the long grass, which would be totally unjustifiable. Now, I don't think the Supreme Court would want to get themselves into that position, because that's a very political position for a legal body. But as we've seen recently in America, where the Supreme Court there have got themselves totally in knots on another issue, the abortion issue, then clearly Supreme Courts are like everybody else. They can make big mistakes. But let's assume your scenario just for a minute, my view is you go with the plebiscite election, because the purpose of the Supreme Court is to see if a consultative referendum passed by the Scottish Parliament was legit, legal. If you're into a general election, it becomes theoretical, because you just campaign in independence and you say, well, what we're asking you for isn't a mandate this time for a referendum, it's a mandate to deliver independence.
Excellent, Alec. On that happy note, we will leave it there, and thank you very much again for taking part, and I hope our listeners enjoyed our brief but friendly chat as always.
Great. Nice to see you, Ian. Cheers.
And to you.